Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. Steve, thanks for coming back today.
Thanks, Monica. Always fun to reminisce and even remember some of these things.
Sure. We are going to talk about placemaking. This is sort of the next phase of neighborhood building, architecture and thoughtful design. I never really knew the term until I started working here, but I think it's been in the lexicon for a number of years in sort of the industry. So I want to sort of kick it off to you and say, welcome, and let's talk about placemaking.
Gosh, as you were asking about placemaking, I was thinking, when did I think about what we were doing was actually placemaking?
Right.
And I'm not sure the year that we actually started terming that. Mm-hmm. As I think back, I'm sort of a naturally born placemaker, maybe, in the fact that our restaurants were some of the first to really turn geographic areas or retail centers into places to be because of the hospitality and food.
Sure.
My first restaurant was on Peachtree Street in an area that had basically been abandoned. It went through, it was the great neighborhood in 1900, then taken over by the hippies, then abandoned during the white flight period of the 60s and 70s, but it was affordable. And so that's where I started. And of course, it was the chic place to come into sort of this, not the greatest part of town. But my second restaurant was in the very Tony Phipps Plaza with Tiffany's and Lord & Taylor. And they'd come to Atlanta 5 years before and opened this great mall, but it had not been successful. And the second level had a restaurant out in New York that had since closed. And the whole second level was sitting empty except for the hair salon and Merrill Lynch brokerage house.
That's incredible to think of
and
today.
So they made me an incredible deal for our second restaurant in the second level of a mall that was closed 5 nights a week in those days. Wow. And we opened, and within 6 months, everything was leased. And so this was really the first time we were branded as, I don't believe we were branded as placemakers back in the 70s, but we were clearly creating places through hospitality. And we did this time and time again as I built out the restaurant company. So as we were looking at building Serenbe, I realized one of the first things we had to have was a place where people gathered around food. And while the financial communities and the real estate communities were looking at me as crazy, and they had so reinforced that I really thought that I maybe was, but I had gone through that place of passion. And so I realized the first thing we had to do was build that place. Right. And of course, that place is the Blue Eyed Daisy. And we planned that immediately when I thought there was just going to be 4 structures. My townhouse, my sister-in-law's, and a friend's. And of course, was what was considered in the middle of the woods.
It was in the middle of the woods.
It was in the middle of the woods. And of course, that reinforced the idea that I had absolutely lost my mind, because if I was really going to do this crazy thing, at least put it on the main road where somebody could see it or find it. But as I look back, I understood that we could not create a place, a destination, if it were just on a main road. We were putting it in the center of what we were building to create a place. And so maybe the words were a little different. I wasn't thinking about it as placemaking, but that's clearly the thought process that we were doing. And you have to have that place where people gather.
Right.
And of course, a gathering around food is a key.
Yes.
And so I think that's the core of any time you're doing placemaking. You have to look at the hospitality piece of it. Which is key. And I think you look at any of the great places that you think of, there's always a food component, that gathering place where we meet over refreshments, food, coffee.
It's true.
Whatever it is.
That's true. So you had a very clear vision. And I know that Phil Tabb, who we've talked about, had done the land plan kind of based on the English model, village model. And so what happens next? How did you know architects? Did you have a vision? Did Phil help you? How does the street come to be? Like, what's that next step?
Well, so several things really contributed. No, I don't think of myself as having an architectural background, although I did start in the University of Colorado in architecture. Soon realized it took far too much energy and years and went into the hospitality industry instead. But I was always keenly aware of architecture. And of course, building out a restaurant company, I was hiring architects and designers and was very aware of how design affects people's attitudes and affects being able to create places that people want to come. So I had spent 30 years hiring designers and architects and directing what we wanted. So it wasn't a foreign thing to me. And we travel a lot, and especially in my 7 years of retirement, we would go to Europe for periods of time, and a dear friend in England that we returned to every year. And I realized, how beautiful and natural and in the countryside, a lot of the English villages. And so that was really our initial guide, that we wanted to bring that character. And you look at America, the New England villages are a lot of the same kind of character. And we think of that charm as being old buildings. But as I really looked at it, it was the scale and the massing and how they fit together on the street. And that could be replicated, or we could do things that were inspired from that. And so that was really my first desire, is to have that. Now, while Phil was moving to be head of the architecture department at Texas A&M and was our fabulous land planner, Phil, as many people in architecture academia, deal with contemporary design much more than historic. So Phil and I were always at odds on what the buildings were going to look like. But Phil has been a master in placement and massing. And I really realized how key that was, as the first year before there was a single building here, Phil had Serenbe as a project for one of his semester classes. And a group of students looked at the land and the land plan for the 12 live-work units, which we now refer to as the Daisy Courtyard. And so I went down at midterm and then for the finals to review this project. And it was just, it was a great project. I absolutely loved it. Of course, it was all contemporary designs. And I already knew that we wanted to begin with the Southern architectural vernacular that's been here. So we really did a study of what had been built over the last 100 years and what was that style. So I knew we wanted to start with that. And so this was a complete different exercise. I understood that. This was students learning architecture, and it was really fun. Phil was finding out the placement. But as I stood back through those classes and the assessment, I was really able to study their model and their individual models. And I realized they had captured the massing, even though it was contemporary architecture, the way the buildings fit together and flowed, and
the roof lines,
the roof lines, and the tallest building was at the hill, and the way it flowed was just a rhythm to it that was beautiful. And so I talked with Phil about how we could capture that, but bringing about more traditional architecture. And so I ended up hiring two of the students to actually capture the massing study, and they did a massing study on the buildings. And so then as we hired the different architects for these more traditional buildings, they had to use the massing study and fit within those footprints.
That's interesting. Is that typical that somebody would give them that parameter? Or
I don't know. Really, I mean, it's what we do with all of our architects today.
Sure.
That's become standard at Serenbe. But that was my first really realization that we could fit this within. But I also, as I had looked at all the developments, and we have some fabulous developments that have happened 70s, 80s, and 90s, and we visited many of those as I was thinking about becoming a developer. What were the lessons learned? Who were doing things I loved, and what were some of the things that I might do differently on our own land? And I realized that all of these were thought of as developments. And their design guidelines were fairly specific and many times locked into a period of time or a period of architecture.
Oh, sure.
And they were clearly developments. And yet everything that was inspiring me were towns. Towns, many of them that had been built over centuries as I looked to Europe and even America. And so I really started focusing on what's the difference. And it was the variety of architecture was one of the biggest things.
Okay.
Because, in towns, buildings are changed. They might burn down. They're changed through time. But the really good places really adhere to the same massing and placement. A good example for me, we lived in Ansley Park before coming here.
Right.
And it's a beautiful old neighborhood with winding streets and all sizes houses.
All different.
And built basically in the early 1900s. So it's all architecture that was from that period of time that was popular. While it varied in style, it was all from that period of time. And then in later years, some of those buildings were taken down, and some very contemporary buildings were placed. And I noticed when that first started, they basically built on the same foundation, and they filled the same massing, and they worked as nice punctuations. And as the years went by, bigger houses were desired. And as I notice it today, they've gotten away from the massing and the placement. And no matter what the style of architecture, it looks out of place because it's just different. So we really, really focused on placement and massing through that first study and then on down. And so coming back to that Blue Eyed Daisy courtyard, we had a buyer that saw the model and thought it was just fabulous.
The modern model.
He saw one unit in the modern model.
I know which one that is, yeah.
And said, let's build it.
Oh, that's great.
And I said, great, because we wanted one. This was really what I wanted to do. And so we hired a Georgia architect and flew the student here to work with the certified architect.
Oh, that's very cool.
To actually then take those plans into construction documents that we could price out or get permits for and build.
And that's Loft 13,
And
right?
that's Loft 13, where the hair salon is. And it's it's a wonderful punctuation along a contemporary street.
But it fits,
And it fits because of the massing and the placement and the perfect. So that's a wonderful story that sort of set what you see throughout Serenbe. So when our civil engineers we insist that they stake the roads, of course, and then I walk it with them to get the grades and make sure the view sheds and the hills and all that. And then Phil and I walk it, and we, with a map that identifies every lot, and we decide where that house sits from the curb and how tall that house is. So that's placement and massing of every house that's designed at Serenbe. And then working with our civil engineers, we have what you call a condition sheet. And that tells you where all of your utilities are stubbed to your site. And it tells you how tall your house has to be, not could be. And it says how far it sits from the curb.
So those are requirements.
Those are requirements. Now, when you design your house, you can always come to the design review board and ask for a variance. And if it makes sense, we've given those. But that gives a specific plan for each lot. It isn't that this street or this is the average. This is what happens on this lot. And so we really focus on how the streetscape fits together to give this flow. And so this is part of this, what now we term as placemaking.
Right.
So if you're coming from the inn, for instance, which is one of my favorite arrivals if you've never been here.
Right.
And you arrive at the old 1905 farm grounds, which are still, this is the farmhouse restaurant now where I raised the children, and the buildings are in the old barns that have been built in 1900s and 30s and 40s. And then you come a dirt road through the cow pasture and cows and horses, and you see the pigs and the sheep. You might see any of the farm animals that are out and about, and you're sure that you've taken the wrong turn.
Yep.
And you come through, and then you come through this wonderful wildflower meadow, which is, of course, the area that was woods that started this whole thing. And then we begin what Phil taught me about the Thornburg transect. And this is where you move from a rural area into an urban area. And it's how you gradually do that through transects. And so we have developed our transects in each of the communities so that architecture varies from transect to transect, as does the landscaping. Now, this is 5 transects within a half mile. So this isn't this is a very specific movement. And so you'll come from natural nature into the first area where we have placed the buildings within the woods. And so there's 20 feet of undisturbed buffer. Not fabulous trees necessarily, but just it's undisturbed. It's like the natural area had been. And then there are houses you see in the woods. And then you come to the next transect, and we introduce curbs and crosswalks and street lights. And for instance, in Selborne, the first, on one side, the houses, the cottages, are stepping up from the stream bed to the street.
Right.
And the first is below grade, actually, before. Right. And on the other side, the houses are stepping down from the hill. And so they're stepping to the street to start creating an urban wall. In the next transect, the front porches of each house are the same distance from the curb. And so it starts making a more organized line. And then that takes you to the next transect where we introduce live works. And they begin at 3-story and then graduate around to 4 stories. And so in this half mile, you move from total rural atmosphere to a very urban 4-story area with shops and residents and all mixed together.
Well, and it's interesting because in that first, when you drive through and you come into the community, the roof lines speak to each other, to your point. So once you do hit the commercial area of Selborne, there's this one corner that you point out almost on all of your tours. It's right by the Blue Eyed Daisy. Will you tell us a little bit about why that's an important corner?
Well, it's I love to give tours, especially to planners or people from cities that are being progressive. Generally, they come here, they're already progressive, and they feel they're very progressive. And generally into the tour, we walk through these places. I've just pointed out the flow of those. The rooftops flow as in nature, as in hills in nature. But more interestingly, it doesn't necessarily follow the topography of the street. Sometimes we accentuate the hill with even a taller building, or vice versa. We might fill out a valley with taller buildings, and it just depends on what we're specifically trying to do to get that flow. But they do flow. They flow as in a canopy of trees flows.
Yes.
And it's within the canopy of trees. And that's a very different experience, because many communities you go to, and it's kind of like jagged teeth, because people do it wherever height you want. And so it's just, think about that the difference between a nice set of
dissonance, a visual dissonance.
That's right.
I don't know if that's
a thing. We never think about it.
Right.
And we don't know why we're a little uneasy when we walk down or drive down some streets. We're here almost everyone comments about the calming feeling as you approach. And so the intersection you ask about, because at that point you've come through the estate houses and the cottages, and you're at the point where you have live works and townhouses and the Blue Eyed Daisy you can see in that one intersection. And even today, with progressive thought, we have some of the most progressive things, I comment that this intersection is still probably not allowed in most places. And everyone says, no. And so I start going through, well, how many of you allow single-family housing next to attached? I mean, you allow them, but aren't they in different sections? And if you allow live works, is it across from your single-family housing? And the hands start going down as to who allow. There's fewer and fewer hands. And then the final question, okay, well, how many of you allow commercial across from residential? Well, no one. And yet all those conditions exist in any community built in the 1930s or earlier. But we have so sanitized our zoning codes over the last few decades that, in my opinion, we've taken the vitality out of where we live. And that intersection with the Blue Eyed Daisy is a perfect example of that.
Right.
And it has great vitality and exciting. And I have no complaints with people living in those townhouses and cottages that all this activity is across the street.
No, they love it.
Yeah.
People want to be
Sit
up
on
there.
your porch.
Exactly. So one of the things that I really like, and you mentioned the curbs and the porches pulled close to the street, and there's sidewalks. So there's sidewalks throughout the community, and I think we probably touched on in a previous episode that there's a trail system that also is part of that. Can you just talk a little bit about the trails and the sidewalks and the sort of vision for that?
Absolutely. One of the great things that I became enamored with in England was the footpath. And the footpath connects through public lands, through the villages, and you can get very easily by foot through all these places. And so that was certainly in my mind, and we wanted to have that here. Then as we developed our plan, we were putting an environmental plan, not worried about the automobile, but first is how could we work with nature? And through that, we came up with the omegas that really allowed you to have every back door opening to nature and every front door to the village street. Right. And so with the omega, we could do that, and it was a great way to bring those roads along the creeks and then across the creek and over. And so that's how these omegas farmed. But we wanted really to have those paths, and so we put the grid of paths in. And of course, in the early days, people were associating us with new urbanism because of the density we were putting in.
Right.
But the biggest difference is new urbanism still has a grid for automobiles, although it is for pedestrians too. But it's a vehicular grid. Where here we are purely a pedestrian grid because our streets wander and wind.
Right.
And so that's different than what most people see in developments today. You see more vehicular grids that exist. And the other thing with our path system is our street lights are located at all those paths. And so they're beacons that there's a public path that connects you by foot to every other place in the community.
I love that. Talk about the porches, because it's interesting that you've set a certain distance from the curb for the porch. But more importantly, every home, relatively, is required to have some form of porch.
As we looked at the Southern vernacular, all of the houses built 100 years ago or more, they all had front porches because they didn't have air conditioning.
Oh,
and
okay. I didn't know that.
So you,
of course.
you lived on your porch a lot of the time, and your houses weren't as grand and big. And so the porches were an important part. And you look at pictures of many of the streets or talk to people. The porch to the street was an incredible communication place. So if they are large enough that they do become rooms, so that's why we require them to be 7 feet wide, and they're to cover 70% of the first floor. And we pull them close to the sidewalk to create that intimacy between the porch and the public realm of the sidewalk. And that's where connections spontaneously can happen. Maybe it's the person sitting on the front porch commenting on someone's dog, or is that a new baby? As I walk carry my new grandchildren, I'm stopped many times by the people on the porch that want to greet the new arrival. And it's that interaction. I would never necessarily be invited into their home because that's a 15, 20-minute stop. But if that house were set back a ways, you wouldn't have that interaction. It would have to be an invitation. So those encounters are lost by the way we've built our houses generally today. And by having the porches close to the street, you have this natural interaction. Now, I think this is important because we have people who moved here now, 15 years ago, and some of them are aging.
Sure.
And we have a few that are not able to drive. They're not as mobile as they used to be. And for them to be able to sit on their porch, and it can be just a hello.
Exactly.
It's this wonderful connection. So for both children and elders, the porch is a huge piece of everyday life that's disappeared from the places we're building today.
Yeah. Well, and that connection to people, right? We need that connection to people, to know our neighbors.
There's enough. We intuitively understood that connection to nature and connection to one another were some of the principal connections and what we call placemaking. Those were the two things that were essential to quality life. And now it's really rewarding to see the actual studies, whether it's medical or social studies coming out, that's actually proving this, that this is a major piece to depression and illness, is removal from either nature or each other.
Yeah. It's incredible. You know, as somebody who lives here, you know, sometimes to go get your mail, which is not at your house, and I want to hear about that from you, like there's centralized mail houses. When I go get my mail, it can take me sometimes 2 hours, to the chagrin of my husband, because I'm end up talking to so many people on the way as well as at the mailbox. The mailbox itself is this funny placemaking tool, if you want to call it that. So tell me about that and where that idea came from.
Well, I mean, you look at some of your old towns, they went down to the central post office, and we just realized that was an important piece. And of course, I'm a visual snob. So I believe my first level of decision was I didn't want a mailbox along the street in front of every house.
Fair enough.
And so you put them in central areas. So that was my first line of thinking. And then as we thought about, well, then we want to place them in places where people are going to gather. You know, if you see, a lonely bank of mailboxes, along a street or a green place like you see in so many communities,
right,
that didn't seem very interesting or appealing. So I wanted them near where people were going to gather for another reason, by a park, by a cafe. Where were you going to bump into a neighbor's? Where was there already activity happening? So it was just part of an activity center, of a gathering center, rather than some place you went to get mail. And I think even today you'll see some of the millennials who don't really go to the mailbox very often now make the journey because it's a social journey.
Yeah. It's a reason to go see people.
That's right. And you're either going to, find people having coffee at the Blue Eyed Daisy, or you're going to be in Grange Green and the kids are on the trampoline, and
everybody else
which is where you
wine,
are, and that's why it takes 2 hours many times to go get it. I think an interesting note on that, we have a couple who have adult children, and they have lived here. They were some of the first people, so they moved in 2005. And their daughter, who lived out of the country, was being married. Second marriage, wasn't a big wedding, but the daughter visited a couple times a year, and so knew a lot of people, and had grown up in a big house in the city, and this house that her parents still lived in. This was their second home. They were just here on weekends. And so she said, even though it's a small wedding, I would really like for some people to know my future husband.
Yeah.
So let's have a reception or party. And So as we arrived, the mother of the bride was sharing with me. She said, it just dawned on me that our entire guest list is almost all from Serenbe.
Right.
And she said, I know everybody in our neighborhood where we've lived for 30, 40 years. She said, my daughter grew up there, but hardly any of them were invited. And I hadn't thought about it.
Right.
And she says, I realize that when the daughter comes home, they're here on the weekends. She says, in the city, when she's with me, she says, we have a garage. We park in the garage. We go to the front porch to get our mail. And when we need something, we get in the car and go to it.
Right.
So she says, I only see the neighbors who I'm invited to a party once a year, or we just don't see them. She says, but Serenbe, I arrive Thursday or Friday. I park the car and never get in again. Within 2 hours of arriving, I have walked down to see what's at the mail. I've run into neighbors. I get caught up on everything that's happened in the 4 or 5 days since we left. And the same thing happened with the daughter. So she knew everybody in a way that she wanted them to meet her husband. And so that's where placemaking is. It's the kind of places we're building that can connect people to one another. And it's huge. And I think the built environment of where we're building for places, people to live, and work really traces back to a lot of our depression and illness issues we have today.
Yeah.
Because we have been building places that remove them from one another and from nature.
And they isolate us.
And they feel isolated. And you look at all the research coming out. People in busy centers are feeling isolated.
Right. Well, look how popular co-working is.
Well, exactly.
People are, don't want to be in their house. They want to go out and engage with other people.
Even if you aren't talking to them, you just want to have that energy force that's near you.
Right.
And so it's huge, So many of these things we just stepped into.
Right.
And it all creates place. But, placemaking is also about beauty. I talk about being a visual snob.
Yeah.
But that's been a key place. And so while the mailboxes maybe began there and it led to a lot of the other social issues, if we build beautiful places, it's also places that people want to gather.
Definitely. One of the things that you do to create beauty, which people wouldn't think about very much, is you hide the trash cans. Just like you wanted to get rid of the mailboxes, which I can envision in, the conventional suburban sprawl. It's a huge lawn, no sidewalks. You've got your mailbox, and then your trash cans are pulled out to the street every day or every week. So, but you don't see them here. Where are they?
Well, as I was thinking about pollution, it's visual pollution. We've talked about the noise pollution. And I realized the way we handle our trash or even recycling really is a problem for both noise and visual pollution. And so, gosh, how do we deal with that? Because we don't have back alleys in a lot of places because people are parking on the streets because we wanted nature to be at the backyard rather than an alley with all those kinds of things. And we were looking at some of the old ways that they used to handle this, and it's a buried trash container sitting right in the front yard.
So this is something that they used to do?
Yeah. You look back, there's places that have done that, and so that's this
really brilliant.
Most of these concepts we have aren't new. This is when we cared more about some of these things. I think we paid attention to it, and then, in addition to the visual pollution that I was concerned about having those little Herbie sitting out, was the noise, because generally there's the big trucks that are beeping because they want to warn everybody they're there. Yeah. But, you're sleeping in, and all of a sudden you have these noisy big trucks coming down the street, and then the noise of picking up those and dumping all your trash. And so we have the buried trash cans. If it's in a clear bag, it goes to recycling. If it's in a solid bag, it goes to trash, and a compost bag goes to compost. And we have a concierge that drive golf carts with carts, and they pick them up twice a week.
Well, and we know all those guys.
And
we're waving to them and we're talking to them too, because they're not in this huge honking truck. They're actually kind of on street level with us, and it's like part of the community. The other thing that we sort of touched on goes back to cars a little bit, is there's limited garages. And I don't want to say that there you're forced to have a limited garage, but there are two sides of the street, and one side of the street doesn't have driveways, which I was probably like never unheard of in typical developments, right? One side doesn't have driveways, which means they don't have a garage. You park your car on the street. The other side typically might have, a gravel drive in the back, and you might have a garage or not. Like we don't, but we're deeded for a garage. But basically, our cars just sit on gravel in the back of our house. It's fine. So that's a kind of a radical concept.
Well, number one is from the beginning, I realized I did not want to build a community for cars. I wanted to build it for people. And so cars were the second line of concern, and visual experience was the first. And then because of the Omega, I didn't want a alley in separating people from nature on the inside where it was very intimate. And each one's a little bit different, but it's an intimate experience with nature. And of course, the real estate community said I would never sell houses when they had to park on the streets.
Right.
But of course, I lived in Midtown Atlanta, and the only way you could park was on the street.
Right.
And, so 100 years ago, that was very common.
I lived in San Francisco,
and there were
same
still
thing.
People coming back to the center city and doing that.
Yeah.
So I didn't
Pretty
see that
popular places.
as a big deal. But and then on the outside, we do have the back alleys. And so you can put a garage there.
Sure.
And of course, our first group of builders our first builder, they just automatically designed and started building garages because that's what they always did. And we realized that people were not attached to protecting their cars. So we made sure that moving forward, garages were optional. You had a building. If you're on the outside of the Omega, you have a parking pad for two cars on your lot, and you have the option to build a garage.
Yep.
And it has to be architecturally beautiful and the same as the house and all that. Well, as you know, there are very few garages.
Yes.
Most people prefer to have that open view of nature rather than have a garage block it.
Yeah.
And so that's a big thing against what people think the trends are, and what's important is very different than what we're seeing when you have the option.
Yeah. One of the last two things I want to touch on is landscaping. I think is really interesting. I know that you were very good friends with Ryan Gainey. For those people who are from Atlanta listening, you would recognize that name. He was one of the top landscape designers. And he wrote a book that I know sort of inspired you called The Well-Placed Weed. But tell me a little bit about the philosophy for the landscape throughout the community.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan was a real character and had designed our gardens in the city and followed us out here and was an inspiration. And even people outside of Atlanta may know of him because when PBS did a national series now, maybe 40 years ago, narrated by Audrey Hepburn, on the 8 gardeners of the world, Ryan was one of those gardeners.
Impressive.
So he was an important figure in the development of gardens through those several decades, and Ryan understood the very formal gardens, but he had a real appreciation for nature in a real biophilic design, although I don't think he used that word, in that if a weed came up that we call a weed, it might bloom beautifully. And in other parts of the world, they may be cultivated into gardens. And so he had an eye to have a very balanced but wild and natural look to his gardens. And so definitely influenced by Ryan. And then as I looked at the environmental movement, I realized how much of a problem lawns are. Because to have a pretty lawn, you have to have chemicals to keep the weeds down and to get it green and all of that. And the problems that chemicalized fertilizers were, I felt, causing, and the proof's coming out now. So the combination between not wanting lawns and Ryan's influence has brought the very natural kind of landscape that you see. And we really think about keeping a natural garden effect on our streets and placing houses within the garden versus landscaping around structures. And that's a very different approach. And so here again, you get that continuity as you drive down the street. And it feels more like one continuous garden versus all these individual places that are saying, look at me, look at how special I am. And so that's a real change.
Well, and also I believe it's trying to really stick with Southern plants, like plants that actually do well here. Another environmental factor. And our neighborhood has edible landscaping. And so I can't remember if we've touched on this in the past, but again, that's one of my favorites.
Well, it looks with all of your landscaping, what's practical. So number one, we're not going to do lawns. Number two, you're going to do things that are native or understand our climate. We're not purists in the fact that it has to be something that's been grown here for 200 years.
Right.
Because you look through history, various things are brought in and become part of that landscape and that culture. And then I'm not sure if we've talked yet about how each community has a commercial focus. And we try to bring that forward in everything, whether it's the street lights and the buildings that are there. But we want to do that with our landscaping too. And so while Selborne you'll see the public art in lots of places and in the landscapes and the sculptures down avenues. And then in Grange, it's edible. So it's not just having the farm there and with the houses backing up to the farm, but we've brought edible plants into the streetscape. So at every crosswalk, you have the blueberry bushes, and it begins with the service berries, and then you have the banks of figs, and then moves to the apples and the peaches and the plums, and then eventually to the nuts. And some of the nut trees are just now maturing to where we're actually going to.
Well, there's herbs all over the
herbs everywhere, and so you can graze as you're you're leaving your house and walking everywhere. And so as we did our third community on health and wellness, there we are dealing with all medicinals. Now, about half of them are edible, but we have an entire garden that's all a medicinal food forest. And we're going to do classes on how to harvest your front yard for some of these very simple things that we've become accustomed to running to the pharmacy for. While you could actually clip and make a tea or eat or make a cream or all sorts of things that we just stepped away from.
The architecture also sort of follows along in that model. It is varied. There is no 6 types of homes and choose your, A, B, C, D, E, and there's not 7 colors. Like, it's very specific. There's a design review board, and it's obviously very thought out. We've talked a lot about that. But tell me, how architects come in and how you found them. And I know that, we have Serenbe Planning Design, which is our own design firm here. But tell me about working with different architects, because that seems to be a very unusual choice as well. Most, quote unquote, developers or developments, they look kind of the same, or to your point, they speak to a time and place. And these homes could have been here 80 years ago. So tell me about that a little bit.
Well, we realized here as I was studying towns versus developments that many of the developments actually had a town architect, and many times they did it all, or they were directing.
I see.
And it was there. And I realized that to do a town, we had to have varied architectural styles. And I had to be careful not to impose my preferences specifically, that it needed to be varied. It needed to be good architecture, but it could be all sorts of architecture. And so, as I said in the beginning, it was for Selborne, it was a Southern vernacular. For cottages. In Grange, it was more of a earlier Southern vernacular that we looked to. And then in Motto, we've gotten to Scandinavian, really the influence. But you could see the same cottage possibly in all three, because we're not absolute and we have that varied. In the commercial areas of each, which is really in the center of the omega, we really try to reinforce that attitude of the commercial focus. So in Selborne, where we're focusing towards the arts, the key commercial areas are from the 1930s, when the art movement was really moving through America from Europe. And so this is why the Hill Restaurant, many of the restaurants look like a collection of buildings from the 30s. But the art building that is yet to be built is designed by Max Scoggins and Merrill Elam, which are some of your leading contemporary architects. And that's all white steel and aluminum and glass and just this incredible piece that will sit on the edge of the forest, but in this 1930s commercial district. So in the Crossroads, that comes from the 1800s, where people put their houses in the rural South at intersections for security and socialization. And pigment to paint was expensive in those days, and so houses tended to be all white.
Everything's white, yeah.
So in that area, everything's white with picket fences. And it's just this charming, you really feel like you've stepped down in time, and the street lamps there are gas lanterns. And then in Grange, the commercial is a lot of one story, as though from 1890, 1900, when the agrarian movement was really taking hold in the South. And of course, you do see our 1 5-story building is actually at that intersection, but that looks like some of your old cotton buildings, either for storage or developing the threads and the yarns and that kind of thing. So that was the inspiration for there. So we've held fairly true to that, and that's the fewest. And so as we were developing with health and wellness, we realized that a lot of our programming that we were looking to for inspiration was coming out of Scandinavia. In fact, I just saw a report just out today, what they monitor every year, the happiest people, and continually it's the Scandinavian countries. And so you deal with health and wellness. You really have to look there. And so we brought a lot of those things into our programming. So I said, well, why not the architecture as well? So I went to Stockholm, through the countryside, into Malmo, and over to Copenhagen, and brought those both historic and contemporary images back to work with the architecture. We've now worked with maybe 10 architects there. And through this now, as you mentioned, we brought some of the architects actually in-house, so that we have our own Serenbe design firm to help really bring this about.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting, the materials and the restraint. And that's another thing that I think is interesting, that, you know, in the United States, we can do anything, right? We can build anything we want, and we build a new house, and we tear down an old one, and we overbuild lots. You can kind of talk about that, or it doesn't fit anymore. And then I put 17 different stones on it because I can't decide, or I've got a turret and a flat roof and this. So that's another thing that I don't think we think about, but that's something that you were very concerned with. So tell me what sort of the guidelines are there.
Well, number one, the first guideline is good architecture.
Right.
And only one style of architecture per house. Now, when we stated that in our design guidelines, that seemed like, but of course.
Right.
It's probably been our most challenging thing to enforce, because we have become used to, or it's become popular to really mix. And I find some of the architects really aren't clear on styles. They have to go back to maybe their early architectural thoughting. And maybe it's because of the popularity of cell phones and people traveling all over, and they just take pictures and they share, we like this, and we like this, not realizing that many times these are in visual opposition to one another. You know, if you look at them individually, oh yeah, that's great. I love that door. I love these windows. I love this roof line, but they maybe don't go together. And so we make sure that it is an architectural style that we understand and it makes sense. And then restraint is one of those big things that we use. I think, how have we gotten to the point where the more we can put on a house, the greater somehow we think it is, and it gets so busy in my mind. But I realize I think it's part of our psychological striving to live in a village that we don't have anymore. You know, we have.
That's interesting.
As after World War II, the big success was the bigger piece of land you could have, and of course, it was more reasonable to build in the open land outside the city. So we had this urban sprawl, and then the highways allowed you to get there. And so people were striving to have bigger houses, more removed. And then the measure of success became how many toys you could have on your own property. So, oh my goodness, if you could have your own pool, you had really made it. And then if you could have your own tennis court, and then gradually, you know, your own movie theater, and then your own cappuccino machine. And then you had so many toys, you had to put a fence around it. And then all your neighbors had the same toys, so you didn't need sidewalks because you didn't need to go to their house because everybody had their own. And suddenly we're totally removed from one another. But I think there's an innate desire to live in villages. And so we keep putting more and more ridge caps on our houses to make it look more like a village. So each house is trying to look like its own little village sitting there in the woods with the same family living there in their own TV screens.
Right.
And I mean, the statistics on depression shows that the way we've been building isn't working.
Right.
And I think this is a huge piece of it.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, obviously I'm not objective because I live here, but I do think that the thoughtfulness that you've placed into where the houses are, where the land is, kind of hiding the garages, the trash cans, has been really, really wonderful. And people do feel it when they come. There's a sort of a sense of calm. And I think there's a visual calm that maybe we don't even realize that we need. And that's part of what they're reacting to, as well as the connection to nature. So thank you so much, Steve. This has been great. The next episode, I want to talk to you about, once you kind of decided to do it, how'd you get anybody here? So
good.
That'll be.
I wonder that myself sometimes. But
So that'll be our next conversation. Thank you so much.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts. For more details, visit our website, serenbestories.com.